few of us would dispute the notion that Donald Trump is a very different kind of American president. But our next guest says that at least one aspect of Trump's presidency, the emphasis on performance, is a trait shared with others in our political leadership. That common trait is having a major impact on political institutions. That's the argument from Yuval Levin, editor of National Affairs and author most recently of The Fractured Republic. He joins us now to discuss this issue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So this really is something that people who follow Donald Trump closely have noticed, is that he does, as in his previous career as a television celebrity, really seem to look at this position as a place to be a performer.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary when you watch Trump do it, because his understanding of the presidency, not really having been shaped by the kinds of experiences that really every past president in one way or another has had, either as an elected official or as a senior military officer. Trump has not been shaped by those institutions and has really been shaped by his experience as a media figure, as a celebrity, frankly, and thinks of the presidency as maybe just the biggest stage he's ever had for the performance that has been his public life. And he approaches it that way. We can see that in a lot of respects. We can see it with the way in which, for example, on Twitter, Trump will often behave as a commentator and talk about something that the Department of Justice has done that it shouldn't have done. You know, they work for him, and he might have told them to do otherwise. It's almost as though he's watching television and yelling at the television, as all of us do from time to time, except this television would actually do what he says if he put it in the right way. And so there is definitely a way in which this is a performative presidency to a greater degree than we're used to. But I would say that it's not entirely his innovation. Our politics has been moving in this direction for a while. There are a lot of ways in which President Obama saw himself also as a kind of performer first and foremost, and we also see it in our other institutions.
That was one of the points that you made in a recent presentation to the John Locke Foundation. It is that it's not just Trump who's being the performer, but we're seeing that among members of Congress, people in the judiciary, other members of our society. How does this issue of treating these political institutions as the basis or the stage for your performance affected the institutions?
So I think that this is really something that's happening across the range of our institutions in American life, where we've gone from expecting them to be fundamentally formative, that is, giving shape to the way that people within them behave and giving even shape to the character of those people, to being more performative, to being platforms for people to perform on. You can see it in a lot of our private institutions. You can see it in the universities, where a lot of people have gone from thinking of the university as a place to be shaped, to be formed by a certain kind of liberal education, to instead be a place to perform, a place to show off to display their moral vanity in one way or another. Journalism has moved in this direction in a lot of ways, and certainly our political institutions have. A member of Congress today will often think of the institution as a platform for himself or herself, as a way to build their national profile, to get on television and radio, as a way to become a kind of political celebrity. And oftentimes that means that they're not thinking about the institution fundamentally as a legislature, and therefore are not fighting for the prerogatives of the institution. And so we've seen Congress become weaker, are not fighting for their own role, their own place in the legislative process, but instead are just happy to use the institution as a way to raise their profile. And so a lot of what they do also is performative.
That is the voice of Yuval Levin, editor of National Affairs, author most recently of the book The Fractured Republic. I guess there is some irony about political observers talking about this performance.
Exactly, right? They're performing for us, after all, yeah.
on a radio show. But how has this transformation into politics as sort of performance art had negative consequences in your view?
Well, the basic trouble is that in doing this other thing, they're not doing their basic work. They're not playing the part that the Constitution expects them to play. And so the Congress has a very important role in our system, the primary role, the foremost and central role. And it is expected to be a very strong legislature when its members are expected to be motivated by an ambition that is channeled through their institution. When that doesn't happen, Congress doesn't do its job, and Congress doesn't insist on its prerogatives, doesn't pass legislation that compels the other branches of government in the way that it is expected to by the framers of the Constitution. And that's part of why we've seen the Congress become weaker over time and leave a lot of important judgments and decisions to the executive branch on the one hand and the administrative state, and to the judiciary on the other hand. Conservatives like me are in the habit of complaining about executive overreach and judicial overreach, and we're right to complain. But a lot of this is a function of congressional underreach and of an unwillingness on the part of the Congress to do its fundamental job, which has to do with the fact that members are actually really doing a different job. You find the same thing happening with judges. Read a Supreme Court opinion by Justice Kennedy now, and you're just watching somebody perform. If someone's putting on a show for you to prove to you just how moral he is. What he's not doing is what a judge ought to do, which is interpret the law and the Constitution. We think of this as a kind of judicial activism, judicial overreach, but it is also a performance, and it suffers from the same problems that we find in the Congress and in the presidency.
How much of this is a function of the fact that we have much larger and more available stage space?
Yeah, absolutely. It's true. There are more places to perform. There are more ways to become a celebrity. But what that's meant is that a lot of our other institutions have been transformed themselves into stages, from the judicial bench to the floor of the Congress. We've seen these places transform into performative spaces, no doubt because there are many more ways to get in front of the public now.
What do we do about it?
Well, I think what's required is some recovery of institutional ambition. And frankly, the only way for that to happen is for the people who occupy these positions to want it to happen. And that means making the case for why a member of Congress ought to see a stronger Congress as serving his own ambition and political interests, why a president ought to see being the chief executive as the way to become an important figure in American life and American history, why a judge should see actually interpreting the law as the way to become important and play the role they're supposed to play. That takes argument, and so really it takes this kind of conversation.
Is one of the problems the fact that no one has really paid a price for being one of these performers? We rarely see people getting voted out because they seem to be playing more to the cameras than doing their job.
Yeah, no question about it. I think that some of this argument that has to be made to voters. Voters certainly are unhappy with Congress, right? The approval rating of Congress, I mean, it doesn't reach much beyond immediate relatives of members and staff, but nonetheless, voters don't respond to that dissatisfaction by insisting that members return to an idea of what a member of Congress is supposed to do that's better enshrined in the Constitution. Certainly the president benefits from being a performer, or at least he thinks he does. Every recent president has thought so. And so, again, the political pressure has to be there to compel our politicians to do what they're required to do by our system of government. And that calls for better citizens, and that's no small challenge, obviously.
Given what you know about the people involved in the process, do you see anyone out there who is willing to move away from this politics as performance art sort of setting?
Well, I think it would take institutionalists, and so there are some in our various branches of government. I think that Justice Alito in the Supreme Court is my model of how that ought to look in the judiciary. I think there are a few people in Congress who tend to think this way. Maybe Senator Rubio of Florida, Senator Lee, Senator Sass. These are the people we look to whenever we think are there exceptions to these problems, but there's a good reason for that. In the administration, this president is a performer, and that's not going to change. I think the question is whether the incentives will be there for someone to run after him by making a case that the president has a particular job and ought to do that particular job.